As it was in the days of Lot, they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even thus shall it be when the Son of Man is revealed. But according to Luke chapter 21, before the Son of Man is revealed, many shall be taken captive by Satan and sin. And we're going to learn in Genesis chapter 14 that Lot's captivity in Chedorlaomer's 14th year, in the lead up to Sodom's destruction 14 years later, provides information about the timeline of Christ's return on Judgment Day. We begin in Genesis chapter 14, verse 14. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. And he divided against himself them, and he and his servants by night, and smote them, and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot, and his goods, and the women also, and the people. So in this passage, we see that God uses the phrase bring again in relation to Lot's captivity. And we've learned in previous studies that the phrase brought back or bring again the captivity refers to a time of salvation and liberty when we are freed from the captivity of Satan and sin. And when we go back to verse 1 of Genesis 14, we discover that Chedorlaomer is a figure of Satan and sin who took believers like Lot captive. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elazar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of the nations, that is the Gentiles. These kings were situated north of Jerusalem, an area historically known as locations where Israel was taken captive by her enemies. In this respect, Isaiah chapter 11 verses 10 through 11 records that Christ, the root of Jesse, was sent to recover a remnant of Gentiles a second time from various nations to include Shinar and Elam, formerly under the reign of Chedorlaomer and Amraphel. When we compare this language back to Genesis chapter 14, we find that the word Gentiles serves as a reminder that Tidal was the king of the nations, that is the Gentiles, a remnant of whom will be saved in accordance with God's covenant with Abraham. Moreover, the word recover is also found in Genesis chapter 14, where it's translated as the word possessor in reference to King Melchizedek, who is the possessor of heaven and earth, which include Lot, the women, and the goods that were recovered in the 14th year of Chedorlaomer. So with that in mind, we need to understand the meaning of the 14th year, or the number 14, in relation to God's people being freed from the captivity of Satan and sin in the lead up to Judgment Day. Well, in previous studies, we've learned that the phrase bring again the captivity refers to a time when Israel retook possession of the land of Canaan. In a spiritual context, the freeing of the captives symbolizes a period of liberty and salvation. Hence, in Luke chapter 4, verse 18, Jesus testified that he came to preach deliverance and liberty to the captives. How does the 14th year of Chedorlaomer relate to this time of liberty? Well, when we go to Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, we find that the end of 14 years, Paul preached liberty to the Gentiles while admonishing those who tried to bring them into bondage through circumcision. In other words, if we try to become saved by our own works, to include circumcision, water baptism, or accepting Jesus, it's evidence that we will be taken captive like Sodom's confederate because we forsook God's covenant with Abraham, in that we turned his grace into lasciviousness, as we will learn in part 3 of our study. Now let's turn our attention to Revelation chapter 13, where God defines spiritual captivity as those who worship Satan the beast during a period typified as 42 months when Satan made war with the saints. The number 42 equates to 3 times 14, meaning it's God's purpose to free his elect from Satan and sin and the church, which was given over to the Gentiles during the 42 months. And so we're not surprised to read in Genesis chapter 14 that Sodom also served, that is, worshipped Chedorlaomer and were taken captive in the 14th year. So with that in mind, we have to ask, are there any verses in the Bible that show that the 14th year is a time when God will save his elect, leading to the end of the world? Yes, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 2, the 14 years are associated with Paul being caught up to the third heaven after 14 years, which is a figure of the rapture when God's elect are caught up to heaven. Lastly, when we go back to Genesis chapter 14, verses 13 through 14, we find a veiled reference to the number 14 in relation to Lot's captivity. In this passage, we read that 318 men rescued Lot from captivity. However, when we add Abraham and his 3 companions, we get an army of 322 men, and the number 322 equates to 14 times 23. The number 23 reminding us of the 2300 days when God executed judgment on the church, the end of which in 2000 AD, when God initiated his program to liberate or to bring his people out of the church. And that's why in Revelation chapter 18, God commands us to come out of Babylon, which is a figure of the church under Satan's rule. But how does coming out of Babylon relate to the number 14? Well, in Matthew chapter 1, verse 17, we find that there are 14 generations from the carrying away of the captives in Babylon to Christ's first coming. This truth is also revealed in the 14th day of Passover, when Israel was freed from the bondage of Egypt in 1447 BC, and after 40 years of temptation, they entered the Promised Land in 1407 BC, which is 1400 years to Christ's first coming in 7 BC. And so, the Bible contains numerous proofs that the number 14 represents a time of salvation and liberty for those like Lot taken captive by Satan and sin. So the question is, does God give us information to help us understand the timeline of Lot's 14 years in relation to the timeline of Christ's return? Although the exact date of Chedorlaomer's 14th year is not mentioned in the Bible, an approximate date can be determined by examining the timeline presented in Genesis chapters 12 and 16. According to Genesis chapter 12, verse 4, Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran for Canaan in 2092 BC. In Genesis chapter 16, verses 3 through 16, we learn that Abraham was 86 years old in 2082 BC and had lived in Canaan for 10 years. Intriguingly, if we go 14 years from 2082 BC, we come to 2068 BC, the year Sodom was destroyed, suggesting that Chedorlaomer's 14th year may have begun in 2082 BC, and his reign over Sodom likely began 14 years earlier in 2096 BC. It's interesting to note that the timeline of Chedorlaomer's reign over Sodom and the destruction of Sodom coincides with two 14-year periods. We found a similar pattern involving the year of release when the captives were freed at the end of 7 years to observe the Feast of Tabernacles. In this respect, the Great Tribulation consists of 4 7-year cycles of Sabbaths when the gospel goes into the world to free God's elect from Satan and sin. But in Genesis chapter 14, God is showing us that the 4 7-year cycles of Sabbaths can equate to 2 14-year cycles of Sabbaths in relation to Lot's captivity. And so in both cases, we have a period of 28 years that began in the year 2000 AD when God's elect began to leave the church because she became a habitation of devils, typified as Babylon, that is Satan's rule over the church. And it's interesting to note that Babylon is another name for Shinar, which, as we learned in Genesis chapter 14, was part of Chedorlaomer's confederate. And so in Revelation chapter 18, God informs us that he doubled the reward or punishment of Babylon in order to recover his people, similar to the recovering of his people in Isaiah chapter 11, where we read that God recovered his people a second time. And the word second time comes from a word that means double. Recall, in Genesis chapter 41, we learned that God doubled Jacob's 7-year dream, which equates to a total of 14 years. And so, like the 14 years between Chedorlaomer's 14th year and the destruction of Sodom in 2068 BC, God doubled the 14 years from 2000 to 2028, during which God will free his elect from Satan and sin and the church in the lead up to the end of the world, typified as the destruction of Sodom.